The
Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Mr. Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, the Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate you, Mr. President, on assuming the responsibility of steering the work of the 76th session of the General Assembly. I assure you of Sierra Leone's fullest support during your tenure. I also commend your predecessor, His Excellency Volkan Boksier of the Republic of Turkey, for the effective and efficient conduct of the 75th session of the General Assembly. We deeply appreciate his efforts in galvanizing a multilateral approach to containing the COVID-19 pandemic and handling its multifaceted impacts through several high-level meetings. I also congratulate the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, on his reappointment. I assure him of Sierra Leone's continued support as he leads and coordinates the United Nations response to persistent global challenges. Sierra Leone associates with its call, among other equally important global matters, for prioritizing COVID-19 response, vaccine access, equity, tackling poverty and inequality, the impact of climate change, and promoting gender equality, human rights protection, and promotion. Mr. President, our collective aspiration as a safe, equitable, and prosperous future has been challenged over the last 2 years. As the world wrestles with the tragedy, trauma, and adverse impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, Sierra Leone appreciates all COVID-19 specific resolutions of the General Assembly and Security Council. Sierra Leone is also fully supportive of all policy initiatives that advance multilateral cooperation on fighting the pandemic and implementing measures to mitigate its long-term effects on lives and livelihoods. We believe that our collective commitment through multilateral partnerships will see our world through the throes of this pandemic, build resilience, and recover sustainably. The theme of this 76th session of the General Assembly, Building Resilience Through Hope, is therefore most appropriate and timely. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted lives and economies, constrained development due to repurposing of development finance and the withholding of private capital, escalated the threat of climate change, food insecurity, broadened the inequalities and justice, and increased fragilities. Nations risk not meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and building resilience against future shocks. However, amidst premature pessimism that the familiar world order has unraveled, Sierra Leone sees the possibility for renewed optimism and new growth. As a nation, we are grateful to the United Nations, friendly nations, and multilateral institutions that have worked with us to navigate the stormy period since March 2020. Mr. President, in Sierra Leone, Through our Quick Action Economic Response Program, we are building fiscal resilience by investing in agriculture, human capital development, and expanding productivity through economic diversification. But we believe our post-COVID recovery will be anchored in increased private sector investments, international trade, and development financing in growth sectors. In that regard, we have created a conducive business ecosystem, amicably resolved business disputes, ratified international trade and labor instruments, and continued to make progress on the fight against corruption because it is good for business and governance. Our structured health preparedness plan that has been implemented with close attention to science and data has helped save lives and protect livelihoods. Mindful of the need to save lives and preserve human dignity, Sierra Leone has been proactive in interrupting transmission chains, curtailing infection, minimizing death, and mitigating the effects of COVID-19 on our population. We commend global solidarity around the provision of COVID-19 vaccines to our nation. Especially, we thank the People's Republic of China, France, the United States of America, the COVAX facility, and other multilateral institutions. We are ramping up vaccination rates and gaining greater vaccination coverage of our population. The worst of the Delta variant may be behind us, but we remain ever vigilant. Mr. President, throughout the COVID-19 period, we have done more to improve human capital development, support the most vulnerable of our citizens and communities, build strong institutions, create more inclusive democratic spaces, build infrastructure, and ensure public service delivery. To our minds, resilience is not to be hoped for. It is to be worked for, and diligently and purposefully so. We no longer wish to be perceived as a nation that is saddled with tragedies and failures of the past. We no longer wish to be seen and spoken about as a nation recovering from civil strife, to Ebola, and from bad governance and economic gridlock to food and climate insecurity. We are a nation striving ever harder to fulfill our enormous potential. Our peaceful democracy has matured. Predictable, regular, and peaceful elections are the norm. Civil society actors are partners at all levels of governance and public service delivery. We have established an independent National Commission for Peace and National Cohesion to foster social cohesion and further consolidate peace in the country. Mr. President, we continue to remove threats to democratic freedoms and human rights. We have repealed a half-a-century-old seditious libel law. No politician or rights activist is imprisoned for expressing his or her beliefs. No journalist is imprisoned for the practice of journalism in Sierra Leone. We have abolished the death penalty in our nation. Throughout the COVID period, we have promoted the rights to education through creative solutions, including nationwide distance learning and hybrid education technologies. We have added 800,000 more learners, increased domestic education financing to 22% of national budget, and learning has continued throughout the period of this pandemic. Our policy of radical inclusion grants tuition-free and safe access to quality education to all learners, including pregnant girls, parent learners, children from poor and rural areas, and children living with disabilities. coupled with comprehensive school safety measures, a revamped curriculum, hybrid education technologies, credible transition examinations, school feeding, school health, and other forward-looking policies, we are making steady progress in Sierra Leone. We seek partnerships to further expand these investments in education, technical training, higher education, and entrepreneurship. Only then can our young persons seize the opportunity to expand the economy, innovate and take advantage of 4IR technologies, and create new possibilities for our nation. In fulfillment of the right to health, we simultaneously battled COVID-19 and other disease burdens such as malaria, HIV, TB, thanks to Global Fund. Gavi has supported the provision of more vaccines. We are reducing maternal and child mortality right across the country and look forward to more partnerships to make even more progress. In respect of the right to work, we have regularly paid salaries throughout the COVID-19 period and provided support for vulnerable populations in Sierra Leone. There is greater internet penetration, and we are increasing energy access through the country through a mix of sources, including solar energy. Mr. President, Sierra Leone associates with international efforts to protect the rights of women, get more women workforce ready, expand access to resources, and promote gender empowerment and equity. Building resilience and inclusive post-COVID societies involves increasing access to justice in a safe and secure society. In Sierra Leone, we have expanded legal aid advice services to poor and underserved persons and established special courts to fast-track cases for sexual offenses, social security, corruption, and small claims, among others. Sierra Leone urges global solidarity on access to justice and remedies for survivors of sexual violence. This is building upon our domestic effort against sexual and gender-based violence. In that regard, I have directed the mission of Sierra Leone to the United Nations to sponsor a standalone resolution on this issue at the General Assembly. Let this be the year that the United Nations will give all survivors of sexual violence the remedy they deserve. We will continue to work closely with partners on cybersecurity, digital public good, and to curb irregular migration of persons. We have complemented international action with local initiatives and cooperation models. Mr. President, the threat of climate change in land degradation, erratic rainfall patterns, rising sea levels and temperatures loom large. These together threaten food and water security, fish resources, and energy access. Sierra Leone is committed to all global climate action commitments and looks forward to participating in the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow and in the 15th meeting of the Conference of Parties of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. We are integrating climate-smart policies and projects into our development priorities. Last year, we established a statutory agency to enhance our capacity to deal with the full cycle of disaster management. But as with other LDCs, the climate financing gap remains a key challenge to implementing our mitigation and adaptation measures. Accordingly, Sierra Leone joins other least developed countries in calling for a green climate fund to meet the $100 billion target to support the mitigation and adaptation plans of developing countries. Thus, we can create new green jobs, especially for the youth and women, create sustainable and inclusive communities, and build resilience against climate change shocks. Mr. President, in spite of this progress, our sub-region in Africa are confronted with peace deficit arising from violent extremism, piracy, and other forces of instability. The Continental African Union and sub-regional ECOWAS are fully engaged. We urge greater collaboration and closer partnerships by the United Nations with these bodies and governments to usher in a more peaceful sub-region. My country provides leadership to the Group of 7+, G7+, conflict-affected and fragile countries. We reiterate the nexus between peace and development and reaffirm our joint call for global ceasefires and the pursuit of peace through national dialogue and reconciliation. Only then can our nations walk out of fragility into sustainable development. Why the COVID-19 pandemic is universal? It has disproportionately affected countries such as ours in the G7+ group. The world's poorest nations face the grim challenge of global economic downturns, reduction in foreign aid, and increase in trade deficits. Therefore, the success of global recovery efforts will depend on the recovery of these countries in fragile situations. We have undertaken voluntary national reviews and peer reviews as self-assessment tools to take stock of the progress we have made and challenges with which we must contend. We believe that with ongoing reforms, we can transition from fragility to a sustainable and resilient future. By investing in human capital development and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions, we believe that that future is attainable. Mr. President, a fairer and more equitable post-COVID-19 world order is possible when all nations and regions of the world can dialogue as equals. We must eradicate hierarchies of power and discuss our common concerns and shared aspirations as equals. Sierra Leone notes the remarkable progress made by United Nations and member states on decolonization. We therefore encourage member states to map out fresh approaches for the advancement of the decolonization agenda in line with the mandates contained in Resolution 1514. A post-COVID world order requires more partnership and more collaboration with input from all nations and all continents across the world. We cannot exclude the voices of 54 nations of the world and 1.2 billion of the world's population that live in Africa. We cannot justify those exclusions with power structures set 75 years ago. We must reaffirm our common values and address our shared aspirations as equals. We can start to redress these gross imbalances by reforming the Security Council to make it more broadly representative, efficient, and transparent, and thus to enhance the legitimacy of its decisions. Sierra Leone recognizes the demonstration of the commitment to instill new life in the discussion on the reform of the Security Council. As the coordinator of the African Union Committee of 10 on the reform of the Security Council, Sierra Leone is pleased to note progress made during the 75th session of the General Assembly in the acknowledgement of the wide recognition and broad support by member states for the legitimate aspiration of Africa to play its rightful role on the global stage. As asserted in the African Common Position articulated in the Eswini Consensus and SAT Declaration, redressing this historical injustice against Africa is an urgent priority. Africa demands no less than 2 permanent seats, with all the rights and prerogatives of permanent members, including the right of veto, if retained, and 2 additional seats in the non-permanent category of the Security Council. On behalf of the African Union member states, I urge all members to demonstrate their renewed commitment towards reforming the Security Council and making it more representative, inclusive, democratic, transparent, and accountable. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by reiterating that Sierra Leone will work with partners to enhance the multilateral rules-based order, collaborate on our shared post-COVID global agenda, and build back better and more sustainably so. Thank you all for your attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone for the statement just made and a request protocol to escort His Excellency.